Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I have the privilege tonight to introduce those who are going to make it a memorable evening for you. And I think I was chosen not just for the associations in the past, but because I had the great privilege of knowing Jack French Kemp, for, I think, probably 40 years. I knew him before he was in politics and before I was in politics. I knew him when his 9 terms in the House, 9, overlapped my Senate career of only 8 years. However, he could hold a job, and evidently I couldn't. I did get reelected. However, then after we had both left office, once again we were thrown together. We served together on a board advising a merchant bank. Now, I thought that was flattering because I thought I could learn from them, but actually when I spent about several meetings with Jack, I was impressed once again. This was a man who loved ideas. And what impressed me was that self-taught, he had become so knowledgeable about private sector finance. And private sector and the public are quite different, if you hadn't noticed. Anyway, what we're going to hear tonight is from experts in Jack Kemp. They are people who can tell you in great detail about the achievements that he made, about the contributions that he made. In the incoming Reagan administration, he was the foremost exponent of what became known as supply-side economics. And the ideas that I think fascinated Jack had great appeal, as they should. He was fascinated by free market economics and what that could mean in the way of policy, free trade, low tax rates that incentivized people up and down the economic spectrum, not just major corporations, but the major employer of America, the small businessmen and women. They were incentivized by the fact that if they could work hard and keep more of what they earned, they were incentivized to grow. So today, he would certainly be the candidate of the Club for Growth. He would certainly be someone who would strike a very, very sympathetic chord with people who are angry and frustrated at what has occurred and also what has not occurred. And he always said to me, you know, you and I believe in enterprise zones, and we've really got to spread the word, and he did. And he also spread the word about many other ideas, including defending the president's policies of preemptive intervention, at least in terms of supplying arms and money to those who are the enemies of the United States, clearly the enemies, as were the Cuban-supported, Russian-supported people who were first known as the Sandinistas in Central America. Well, my job tonight is to not tell you the story. I'm looking forward to reading this book because I am guaranteed that it will be not just interesting, but damned interesting. First of all, because of the subject, and second, because of the 2 men who have written it, who have collaborated on the book in a way that I think is absolutely fascinating. One would write a chapter, and then the other would write a chapter. The first, the second, and then they filled it in. But what I can tell you is that these are both extraordinary journalists. But they have been together on many ventures before. They started some time ago. Mort Kondracke was the editor of Roll Call. I'm sure many of you who have spent time in Washington are familiar with it. And he continues to write a very well read, I think one of the best read columns in the country on politics, called Pennsylvania Avenue. And thereafter, both he and Fred Barnes, who is now the senior editor and co-founder of the Weekly Standard, spent some time covering the White House. Just about the same time They were both working for the New Republic for a period of years. They also went on and became not just print journalists, but celebrated panelists. Mort was on David Brinkley's This Week with David Brinkley on ABC TV. And they did appear together. They were on a show called The McLaughlin Group, headed by John McLaughlin. They then went on Fox News and co-hosted The Beltway Boys. And now they have brought us what is the first ever biography of Jack Kemp. As someone who knew and very much admired and liked Jack, I am delighted that they are the ones to break the ground on an important subject. I do have to tell you one thing. When they were on the McLaughlin Group, I had watched it many times, but one morning I persuaded Gail, my wife, to watch it, and she said, "Turn that off. Those are the 5 rudest men I have ever seen." Well, she got over it. I don't know that they did, but in any case, it was after that that they did co-host the Beltway Boys. They have gone on to great success. I'm not quite sure why Roger Simon agreed to be the moderator. Roger is a celebrated person in his own right, the author of 10 novels, the author of 7 screenplays, more than one of which has been nominated for an Academy Award. He was the West Coast president of PEN, P-E-N, a widely respected association of writers, journalists, people concerned with civil rights, with human rights. And he has gone on now to turn his back on the mainstream media and to offer those who are seeking, as he terms it, quality independent journalism, the opportunity to read it and hear it. He has an audience of viewers and readers that now reaches 13 million. So there seems to be an approbation of his judgment about that. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to have a fascinating evening tonight because it is a fascinating subject. And it is my pleasure now to say, gentlemen, you are on.
Well, I'm not going to talk very much because these guys are great talkers. I was at a luncheon today for them that was held by a group called the Friends of Abe. How many of you? Nobody knows what it is. Few people know it. It's a supposedly clandestine group of Hollywood conservatives, but it's not that clandestine anymore because they write about it in the Hollywood Reporter. So, so you're in on a secret that's no longer a secret. However, what I want to say just before I start asking some questions, these gentlemen, is that I did read the book over the weekend. And I want to say to everyone in this room that this is a really read. And it is something you should actually pick up and read now because it really, really fits the election that we're all in the middle of right now. This endless election that is currently going on because it besides being a great biography of Jack Kemp, obviously, it is also an interesting lesson in supply-side economics, as the governor mentioned. And it's such a good book that those of us who kind of skipped over economics in college, I did take Samuelson's brainwashing on, but that was only one course, and got a really good overview of supply side, and supply side is, I think, what we need right now. So I really recommend this book, not just to be polite. What I usually do at a gathering like this, I buy the book, I get an autograph. Also, go home and read it, because it is something that you can pass on to your neighbors. Some interesting information. Okay, let's enough of me. Let me get on to the. Let me ask first Mort this question: the provenance of this book. How did the whole thing, the project of doing this Kemp biography, begin?
So when I got replaced by blondes on Fox News, and sort of faded out of my journalism career after years and years of telling Congress and the president of both parties to please stop fighting with each other and get along, and I decided I couldn't stand to listen to myself anymore, and I was fading out of column writing. Along came the Kemp Foundation, the Jack Kemp Foundation, and asked me to do an oral history of Jack Kemp's life. So I interviewed 100 football players and congressmen and staff members and family and friends, and so then the Kemp Foundation also endowed a chair at the Library of Congress, and somehow I managed to find my way into it, even though I didn't have a PhD. I thought, a PhD historian would get the chair, but no, I got the chair, and all Jack's papers are at the Library of Congress. So I spent 3 academic years, actually, combing through the papers and starting to write the book. And then at the suggestion of Dave Smick, who was Jack's chief of staff, I enlisted Fred to help me write the book, and there it is. It finally is here with us.
Well, I mean,
I said yes.
clearly. So let me return to you. I know that you guys, from having read the book and also heard you say it over lunch,
Yeah.
you had 4 intentions in the book. Could you 4 intentions in writing it? Could you spell those out?
Well, I'll give you a couple, and Mort can give you a couple. One of the things about Jack Kemp is he had a very interesting life. He was a pro football player. He was self-taught in economics. He had, as a backbencher in Congress, he was extraordinarily influential. And of course, we say in the book, the first sentence in the book is that Jack Kemp was the most important politician in America in the 20th century who was not president, the most influential, and certainly the most, if you disagree with that, he was certainly the most influential Republican who was not president. So that's one reason. And another reason, Kemp has relevance, as Roger suggested, has relevance to today's presidential election. The type of politician he was, who thought ideas would be are the thing that should drive politics in America, and not merely attacks on other candidates and so on, which he refused to do, by the way. But he pushed ideas, one in particular, as Governor Wilson said, supply-side economics, and he succeeded. Those are a couple of the reasons, Mort.
Yep. Well, that's a summary of all of the reasons. The only the only other reason is that Fred and I got to sort of relive our careers, our journalism careers, through the focus of Jack Kemp's life and influence. But the most important reason, I think, is the one that we list as the 4th one, and that is that America is in trouble. Much as it was in the 1970s, maybe worse than it was in the 1970s, with glacial growth and flat median incomes. And Jack Kemp always said that when you have stagnant growth and people's incomes are not rising, politics becomes the business of pitting one group against another, blacks against whites, rich against poor, North against South, Sun Belt against Rust Belt, and so on. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing some candidates are the 1% versus the 47%, the rich against the poor. Donald Trump is trying to blame everything on Mexican immigrants. Republicans are all blaming President Obama. President Obama is blaming the obstructionism of congressional Republicans, and nothing is getting done. And so the public is furious, and it has a right to be furious that Washington is so inept and so gridlocked that major problems in the country, an enormous debt, crumbling infrastructure, an education system that lags the world, an immigration system that everybody acknowledges is broken, they can't fix anything because they can't agree on anything. And the country wants to shake things up. Well, Jack Kemp shook things up, but he did not shake things up by pitting insiders against outsiders, by throwing insults at his opponents. He shook things up with big ideas, and he always said that politics it should not be the art, that the purpose of a political party is not just to win elections, but to deserve to win elections by producing ideas and policies that will make life better for ordinary Americans. So we were hoping that, and still hope, that this book will either inspire or embarrass the current crop of politicians of both parties, but the Republican Party in particular, to try to emulate his example of optimism and pro-growth policy and idealism and inclusion and compassion. He was a compassionate conservative. So we're hoping that that's what the book will accomplish. There's your answer.
Great. Well, speaking of inclusion, which you mentioned there, and one of the things that struck me about Kemp, has always struck me about Kemp, is the idea of these enterprise zones. I know this was taken up a bit by Rand Paul recently, but why do you guys think that, I mean, it seems like such an obvious and good idea. What has been the resistance and why has it, maybe you should also explain to those who don't know what it is, what I'm referring to.
Well, yeah. Well, an enterprise zone would be an area of a depressed community, one where businesses had left, and you would eliminate all taxes on the businesses that come in there, or where the investors can invest and not have to pay the capital gains tax and property taxes and other taxes. They'd be lured in there, and then to hire people in the neighborhood to work there. They'd be trained and work there, and they could revive really depressed neighborhoods in cities and towns across the country. The resistance has been really, really striking, and there have been some sort of quasi-enterprise zones that have had a modest success, but the problem has been not eliminating in particular the capital gains tax, a tax that can be, by being reduced or eliminated, can really have an incredible incentive effect, but it just hasn't been there. And the group that does enterprise zones are popular with a lot of conservatives, not all of them, but liberals don't like it. Labor doesn't like it, and Democratic presidential candidates don't like them. Bill Clinton talked about them and created things called empowerment zones, but they just didn't provide any of the incentive effects needed, and they basically failed.
Because one of the great things that you read about in your book about Kemp is that he really reached out to civil rights. I mean, he was not the image that one has popularly of Republicans of being white men in limos that don't have any interest in this stuff. Right. But he really did. And when I was reading the book, what disturbed me, I was reading Mort's reaction to this, is that I wish more of the people in our party would follow the lead of Kemp on this, and that way bring in blacks and Latinos and Asians certainly into the party. But I don't. Yeah. What's happening?
So when Kemp ran for president, when he ran for vice president, one of his major themes is that there is no group whose votes we are not going to seek, and so. Alone, practically, in 1988, when he ran for president, among the presidential candidates, he went to speak in African-American neighborhoods, in Hispanic neighborhoods, and everybody else was confined to the usual base areas, the suburbs and so on. When he ran for vice president with Bob Dole, he would campaign. He went to Sylvia's restaurant in New York, and he went to the inner cities. He'd been HUD secretary after all, and he had been practically the entire urban policy of the Bush administration. George H.W. Bush was not very interested in urban policy, and Kemp was sort of it. And he traveled the ghettos and the barrios of the country all the time. so his message to the Republican Party was, go there, talk to the people there, understand what their lives are like, understand what they really want, and what he decided that they really wanted was opportunity, not handouts, opportunity. And Republicans tend to assume that all minorities want is handouts. It ain't necessarily so. So Kemp, from childhood, but especially as a football player, had a lot of rapport with especially African Americans. I mean, it was famously said of him that he had showered with more African Americans than most Republicans have ever met. And he believed that a lineman who could protect him from an onrushing defense, it didn't make any difference whether the guy was black or white or whatever color he was, as long as he could block, and save Jack Kemp's neck. Or could somebody catch a pass? Could somebody take a handoff? Could somebody run down the field? Didn't make any difference whether they were black or white. And he was the president of the American Football League Players Association and fostered integration in the cities of the American Football League.
Roger, let me comment on that because it's more relevant today, the idea of Republicans doing well with minorities and immigrant groups and so on, because Republicans need their votes. The argument's been, as I'm sure you've heard many times, that, well, why should Republicans go into an African-American neighborhood because they're not going to get any votes there? Well, if they don't go in there, there never will be any votes there. And the point is, I mean, you can look at the difference between how George W. Bush did in the Hispanic community. He got 44% of the vote in 2004, and Mitt Romney in 2012 got 27% of the vote. I've actually done some back-of-the-envelope math on this, and if Romney had gotten what Bush had gotten, 44% of the Hispanic vote in 2012, he would have come much closer to Obama, losing by less than 1 million votes. And you also have to realize that if he did better with the Hispanic vote, he would also do better with the Asian vote. I'm not sure about the African American vote, but certainly in 2016, without President Obama running, Republicans have an opportunity to do better there as well. And they need to. It's all about winning. You're not going to win unless you do better than your last candidate did with those groups. It's a necessity for Republicans now. And when I hear some of the candidates, and we'll hear them tomorrow night if you watch the Republican debate, come out with positions on immigration in particular. And Jack Kemp was very pro-immigrant. Ronald Reagan was very pro-immigrant. Both wanted to, well, under Reagan there was some immigration reform. When they come out against that, and this includes a number of the presidential candidates, they're dooming the Republican Party in 2016, I believe.
Do you think there are any Republican candidates out there right now that Jack Kemp could get behind?
No, I think he could get behind Marco Rubio. I think he'd get behind John Kasich. I think he'd get behind Jeb Bush. I think he'd have a lot of trouble getting behind Donald Trump. I think he'd probably like, as most people do, like Ben Carson, but he'd ask Ben Carson to please explain what his policies are.
He's going to have to.
Yeah. But there are a number of them, and there are probably a few others as well.
He probably would give time to Chris Christie as well. He would like Donald Trump's tax reform. He would, Donald Trump has the kind of high energy that Jack Kemp had, but in every other way, Donald Trump and Jack Kemp are polar opposites. Jack Kemp never insulted an opponent, never went negative, believed in immigration reform. I mean, the whole idea that you're going to take 11 million people and you're going to deport them. I mean, just the spectacle of this to the rest of the world, and then you're going to let the good ones back after they've been, and you're going to decide. I mean, why wouldn't you decide who the good ones are and before they anyway? Jack Kemp would have abhorred Donald Trump, I think.
Right. Well,
Although he wouldn't have said anything bad about him.
that leads me to actually the question I
Yeah.
was going to ask. And is, when I read the book, I kept asking myself, well, you know, Kemp obviously came this close to the presidency a few times there. Would he have made a good presidential candidate? What do you guys think?
Well, go ahead.
I think the answer is yes. Jack was, among other things, Jack was a leader. He was a quarterback. He realized that that a quarterback in politics was different from a quarterback in football. In football, the quarterback was a dictator. In the huddle, he was the boss. He had the vision of how they were going to win. He called the play. He told the other players, this, because he was a quarterback before the coaches called all the plays, as they do now, even in high school, but certainly in the pros, Jack called his own plays. Well, he discovered that it was a little different in politics, that rather than order people around, what he needed to do was create a coalition. And he did. One of the remarkable things that Kemp did was really build a supply-side movement nationally. He was really more of a national figure than a House of Representatives figure. He wasn't in a major committee. He wasn't a chairman of anything. He wasn't in the leadership. One of the things he didn't do was attack the leadership. And what he did was just organize a movement that consisted of economists, who, including those who had really created supply-side economics, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, all these young congressmen who got elected in the 1970s who became followers of Jack, whether it was Newt Gingrich and Ben Weber and Dan Lundgren and Dan Coates and many, many more. And then his final convert to supply-side economics was a man named Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan was always a tax cutter. There wasn't any problem there, and the Reagan people will tell you, and I think correctly, that Jack was pushing an open door when he made the supply-side argument with Ronald Reagan, but it was a different type of tax cut that he was proposing. Supply-side economics, it's not just a targeted tax cut here and maybe a tax cut for that will give families more money. It's not that he was against those. He just thought, if you're going to promote economic growth, that's going to help, that is going to create a rising tide in which all boats will rise and all people will be better off, or at least the vast majority of them. The best way to do that is to provide incentives, and you do that by cutting across the board all the income tax rates. And that's what Kemp proposed. That's what Reagan adopted. That's what was enacted in 1981 and then followed up in 1986 with tax reform. And that's what generated nearly a quarter century of prosperity in America.
Yeah. He did run for president in 1988, and he basically finished third behind George H.W. Bush and Bob Dole. I don't think it was in the cards at all that Kemp could have won the nomination. I mean, Ronald Reagan functionally endorsed Bush, and Bush had been Reagan's loyal vice president, and the country was very happy with the way Reagan managed and wanted to give Reagan a third term, which obviously the Constitution prohibits. But Bush was his anointed successor, and Kemp's achievements, supply-side economics, the 81 tax cuts, the 86 tax reform, were Reagan's accomplishments, right? And whatever Reagan had done, Bush got credit for doing, even though Kemp was the intellectual originator of them. And Kemp did not really have an idea that he could sell as new. Now, his one idea that was new, he could never sell, and that was the gold standard. Yeah. And the more he tried to explain the gold standard, never mind. Yeah. I mean, it made everybody's eyeballs roll, and he
except Ron Paul.
He could never get it across why this was important, and to tell you the truth, there were also flaws in his campaign. I mean, he did run his campaign like he was a play-calling quarterback and didn't delegate enough, and he wanted to determine the content of his fundraising letters, and he didn't like to fundraise either. That was another thing, and he talked too long. The famous, there are a couple of great stories. One of them is the joke about Jack Kemp was that he gets captured by the Gestapo, and the agent says, "Mr. Kemp, we have ways of making you stop talking." And another one was that he was speaking in Iowa, and after he got done with the speech, the mayor of the town says, "Congressman Kemp, those are three of the very best speeches I've ever heard." You know, he thought if there was one face in the audience that looked like it was in doubt about what he was trying to say, that he had to repeat what he'd said and convince that person, even though, you know, everybody else in the audience would have been convinced with just one speech. So there were flaws in his campaign. He might have had a better chance in 1996, but he decided not to run because he didn't want to spend all this time raising money.
The best chance for Kemp to be president would have been to be picked as Ronald Reagan's running mate in 1980. He would have been the running mate. He would have been in the position, presumably, after 8 years that George H.W. Bush was, to be basically anointed to run as the Republican nominee in 1988, and of course Bush did and won. There's a great story about Kemp and the effort that was made in his behalf at the Republican convention in Detroit in 1980, the one in which Ronald Reagan was nominated for president. And Kemp had been assigned to give a speech on the second night of the convention in prime time, between 10 and 11, would have been on national television in prime time, and he was to speak after Barry Goldwater and before Henry Kissinger. The three of them were to be squeezed in that time, 10 to 11 time period. This was a pretty good assignment for Kemp. And what happened was that Barry Goldwater came on first and talked and talked and talked and talked and ran way over. So much so that the Reagan folks, who were really in charge of the convention, Mike Deaver in particular, decided that they really wanted to have Henry Kissinger on because he could endorse Ronald Reagan's foreign policy and so on. And so they called down and said, "Well, Jack, you're not going to be able to speak tonight. You'll have to speak tomorrow night." And Kemp was crestfallen, but he accepted it and told his supporters, "Don't worry, I'll get to speak tomorrow night." And then he leaves the area around the stage and goes out in the floor of the convention. And so Deaver calls down to the stage to tell him to introduce Henry Kissinger. But there was a man there who was actually there who told the woman who read the introductions, "Don't do that. Introduce Jack Kemp." This was a man named Tommy Evans. He was a nondescript congressman from Delaware, a Republican, someone who knew Jack Kemp very well, someone who liked Jack Kemp, someone who believed in the Kemp economic philosophy. So he tells this young woman.
And wanted him to be vice president.
Yeah.
Wanted him to be picked for vice president.
Yes, he did. And tells this young woman, "Introduce Jack Kemp." And she doesn't want to do it. She knows what the orders were from on high. And he has to yell at her, do it, introduce Kemp. So she does. And, Dave Smick, his chief of staff, all of a sudden is out in the crowd, and all of a sudden he hears this introduction, saying, "And he was a quarterback for the San Diego Chargers." And he realizes, wait a minute, they're not introducing Kissinger. They're introducing Jack Kemp.
Clearly.
And they can't find him. He's out in the audience somewhere, and finally Dave Smick and some other Kemp people are running around. They finally found him because they could see his head of hair above other people. Remember his hair? Yeah. Very good hair. And so they bring Kemp up and find him, drag him up, and his speech is put in the teleprompter, and he reads a couple lines, and then just goes off and gives his great speech, just winging it, but he knew how to talk about economics and supply side and lifting all boats and a greater America and prosperity for everyone. speech of his career, a fantastic speech, followed by a demonstration out in the audience for Kemp for vice president. And it was an incredible coup by Kemp, but Reagan and the rest of them decided they didn't want Kemp to be their vice presidential running mate. They wanted somebody who could more balance the ticket and so on. As Mort has reminded me, they didn't want a movie star and a football player, and so they wound up with George H.W. Bush. But if it had been Kemp, he would have been president, eventually.
Bob Dole, who lacked high esteem for Jack Kemp, always said that Jack Kemp's idea of tax reform was a special break for hairspray.
That was pretty mean.
And he also said, well, he also said famously, there was a busload of supply-siders that went off a cliff. That was the good news, and the bad news was that 3 seats were empty, and the 3 who were missing were in a huddle. Get it? And always referred to Kemp as the quarterback, and he didn't mean it that with great fondness. He thought it meant sort of the jock, right? But he picked him for vice president because he knew that Kemp could energize the convention. And actually, Bob Dole, when in 1996, came out for 15% across-the-board tax cuts and adopted a supply-side formula, which he understood would help his own campaign.
Your book does have certain heroes and villains, and part of the drama of it taking you inside the Reagan administration, the struggle for Reagan. You feel like it's a struggle between Kemp and David Stockman, supply side versus balance.
It was called Deep Root Canal Herbert Hoover economics was what Kemp used to call it.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, they thought David
raising taxes and slashing budgets, austerity is what Kemp was against. Kemp
Yes.
believed that what John F. Kennedy always said, a rising tide lifts all boats, and that if you can have a prosperous economy, a growing economy, everybody will benefit. He later became convinced when he was HUD secretary that there were some boats that were just stuck on the bottom and needed government help, like enterprise zones, in order to lift them off the bottom. But you're quite right. There was a lot of combat that went on in every administration that Kemp had anything to do with. He was never quite in sync with the presidents of his own party, let alone the other party.
Yeah, your point about David Stockman, though, is some of you all will remember him. He was a young congressman from Michigan who had been an ally of Jack Kemp up until about the time Ronald Reagan got elected president. And David Stockman was made the budget director, the head of the Office of Management and Budget. Excuse me. And he changed his mind. He became a tax raiser rather than a tax cutter, as were other members of the Reagan administration in the White House, including Richard Darman and Jim Baker, the chief of staff, to some extent. And so there was a battle in the White House to change Reagan's mind about supply-side tax cuts. And Jack Kemp is obviously one of the heroes of our book, but so is Ronald Reagan, because he resisted all these efforts, all these leaks to the press, all the stories that were written in the press about quoting unnamed White House sources about how Reagan had to change his mind, or he was going to, or this, and Reagan stood firmly, did not cave. The next year, he agreed to a tax increase of basically eliminating some of the loopholes and preferences that were put in the 1981 tax cut, but basically cutting deep cuts in individual tax rates. Reagan stuck with that, and with Jack Kemp's encouragement, of course.
and now we're going to have a Speaker of the House who was a Kemp acolyte.
Yes, I mean, Paul Ryan was his major assistant for a couple of years, right out of college, and Paul Ryan says that he learned his politics, he learned his economics in college, he learned his politics from Jack Kemp, and Paul Ryan, I think, he sort of lacks Kemp's charisma and high energy, but he has the soul of Jack Kemp. Kemp's chief African-American advisor is a guy named Bob Woodson, who is the head of something called the Neighborhood Enterprise Association, which is basically encourages self-help activities and private enterprise in ghetto areas. And alone among, Woodson was at a dinner that I was at a couple of weeks ago, and he said, you know, I've been visited by Marco Rubio, I've been visited by Jeb Bush, I've been visited by John Kasich, and you know, and they listen to me, and you know, they'll go out into the ghettos with me and talk to some people once in a while. But the guy who really gets it, the guy who really spends time with African Americans learning about what it is that they're hoping to do to get out of poverty is Paul Ryan.
Are we ready for the audience?
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you, guys. I know we have some questions. I'm going to ask the first one. Kemp's support of President Nixon when he was in Congress. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, he was he campaigned for Nixon in 1968, and was fundamentally a supporter of Richard Nixon, and took a very wait and see attitude toward Watergate. But there were certain things that Nixon did that Kemp did not like. But Nixon was the first Republican president that he opposed, and he got it crosswise with all of them, and that was over wage and price controls. You know, inflation was the abiding problem of the 1970s. Richard Nixon tried to impose wage and price controls. He also took the United States off the gold standard. Kemp also opposed that. So fundamentally, he was a supporter, but he opposed him on those two things.
Yeah, Kemp was a Republican after all. He was a Republican by birth. His parents were Republicans. It was said of his father that he was still out trying to drum up votes in 1932 for Herbert Hoover when FDR had already been declared the winner of the election. So it was a pretty Republican family.
Our next question.
Good evening. I believe I saw you gentlemen on a recent interview with maybe C-SPAN. It was terrific. I haven't read the book. I'm looking forward to it. I have the pleasure of living down the street from the library here. So I wanted to ask you if you would just expand briefly on Kemp's relationship with President Reagan on a personal level.
He worshipped him. He had been his intern when he was with the Chargers. Herb Klein, who was the editor of the San Diego Union and then became Richard Nixon's communications director, sort of adopted Kemp and realized that Kemp was more than just a quarterback, and had him writing columns for the San Diego Union, and started getting him on the speech-making circuit, and arranged for Kemp to be an intern in Reagan's communications office when Reagan was governor. And Kemp, you know, even though there was this, Fred referred to it, this idea floating around that Kemp might run against Reagan in 1980, that was never going to happen. I mean, Kemp was always for Reagan. I mean, he sort of toyed with the idea or let it fly out there in the ether in order to encourage the Reaganites to adopt supply-side economics as their policy.
But there were people encouraging.
Oh yeah, no
Jack
question
to
about
run.
it. There was a whole apparat.
Yeah.
Irving Kristol and
Evans and
Frank
Novak.
Shakespeare and Jude Winniski and Bob Novak really thought that it was time for a generational change, and that Ronald Reagan was too old. And Kemp, you know, Kemp endorsed Reagan privately, and then was talked into withdrawing the endorsement, and it went back and forth. But fundamentally, he thought Reagan was the guy who ought to be president, and they were so alike in spirit. I mean, you see those, we went to the Reagan Library yesterday where I had never been before. Fred's been. And you see that smile, that ebullience, that, you know, upbeat, optimistic spirit. That's what Jack Kemp and Ronald Reagan shared, even though they had their policy differences. When, you know, when Kemp was opposing Reagan on tax increase policy, because he did raise taxes a couple of times, several times, as a matter of fact, and Kemp was always against it. And the White House staff was always leaking these stories about how Kemp was disloyal to his president, and, you know, he's doing it for his own political advantage and stuff like that. And Reagan would get asked, are you and Kemp now enemies? And Reagan would say, no. Yeah, Jack may be unreasonable, Jack may be a purist, but no, we're friends, you know, and they were.
Next question to your left.
Hello, I'm a graduate of Occidental College, which is the proud home of Jack Kemp Stadium where the Oxy Tigers play football. I would like to know, did Jack Kemp's experience at Occidental College influence his political and economic thought?
Well, the big influence was that he met Joanne Maine.
Yeah, that really was. You know,
that
Jack
was transformative.
Jack was a phys ed major, but he really majored in football. That was what he was interested in college, and it was after that he began to read the Wall Street Journal, economic books. He went to a couple of summer sessions of a group called the Foundation on Economic Education in New York, which taught free market economics. He was self-taught, but as Governor Wilson said, he was well self-taught and was smarter about economics than almost anyone in Washington. Supply side, what Jack did was not only a political achievement, but it was an intellectual achievement. Because if you can remember back to the 1970s and how miserable they were, and stagflation and high inflation and high unemployment and so on, the liberal economists had no answer. They don't today have an answer. But Jack Kemp had an answer. And Ronald Reagan adopted that answer, and we know what happened. It worked. But if it were the liberal and Keynesian economists won't admit today that supply-side economics worked, but it was better than any alternative they had, and it did work.
You know what the irony is that Jack modeled his actual bill on a proposal that John F. Kennedy had made in 1962, and which Lyndon Johnson pushed through Congress after Kennedy's assassination, which lowered the top rate, which was 90% in 1962, to 70%. And Kemp always quoted a speech that John F. Kennedy gave at the Economic Club of New York, saying that it's a paradoxical truth that at the same time you have high taxes, you have low revenues. And the way to get more revenue is paradoxically to lower taxes. And this was a supply-side argument made by John F. Kennedy. When John F. Kennedy made it, the Democrats all loved it, and the Republicans hated it. When Ronald Reagan proposed it, vice versa, you know. And not all Republicans liked it when Reagan proposed it. But, you know, he managed to convince the country that it was the right thing to do. And the history was that it did work.
Next question.
Thanks for being here tonight. I couldn't help but think, and staying on the football theme, that the two of you have become the wide receivers for Jack. And boy, what a great pass he has given to the two of you. And I'm looking forward to reading the book, but I'd like to know, too, how I could, or even some of these folks here, could help to get a certain guy this book down Pennsylvania Avenue. I think Mr. Obama needs to read this book, and I'll do whatever I can to make sure he gets it.
If you've got his, if you can get it to him, we'll be happy to have him read it.
There you go.
And Obama did, you know, give Jack Kemp posthumously the Presidential Medal of Freedom, not because of supply-side economics, however.
We would at least like to get the Republican presidential candidates to read it, but if we've had any success so far, we're not aware of it.
So the question is, and this is coming from where I think you've made it clear tonight about Jack and maybe the legacy that he's trying to leave this country. How can we possibly bring civility back to this nation in our discourse, in our politics, in our communities? Because I've been around long enough now. I've seen local politics that is completely in a disheveled mess because of what I believe is going on in our government. And it's time that we do get Jack's principles back. And I think there is a way to do that, and I applaud you for writing a book that is at least leaning in that direction.
Well, my answer, it is a difficult task because increasingly Americans live in two different information universes. Their fact base is different. It used to be that everybody watched Walter Cronkite and got John Cameron Swayze and all those people, and sort of were operating off the same information base. Now Republicans are all watching Fox News, Democrats are watching MSNBC, and all they hear is propaganda to whip their side into a rage against the other side, right? So the public is polarized, and the politicians are polarized for many reasons, including gerrymandering, including the fact that they don't live in Washington anymore. Their families don't mix together, aren't members of the same little league teams and stuff like that. Whereas Jack Kemp lived in Washington, traveled to Buffalo. His kids went to school with Democrats. He had Democrats over to dinner all the time. Sam Nunn was a friend. Henry Nowak was a congressman from New York, was a good friend, and he had lots of Democratic friends. And they don't have those kinds of friends anymore. But it's the president's job to create that kind of an atmosphere. And George Bush said that he was going to be a uniter, not a divider. He didn't succeed with that. Obama promised that he was going to unite red America and blue America into the United States of America, and he utterly failed, never even tried. So we've got to get a president who, instead of ripping the country apart, will put the country back together again as best he possibly can. And it's going to be tough, but it's necessary, because other countries look at the United States and they see the dysfunction of our government and the threatening shutdowns and threatening defaults on our national debt and all that kind of stuff, and they see a weak country. China sees a weak country. Russia sees a weak country, not only because of Obama's foreign policy, but because of the divisions in the country. So we need leadership, and Kemp is a model that I wish somebody would adopt, clearly.
I agree. It has to come from the top, and it certainly isn't now. Even at the top of the Republican Party, one of the things that Donald Trump, for all the things that people may like about him, civility isn't one of his attributes.
No, nor is it with Ted Cruz. I mean, Ted Cruz is a despised man among his colleagues in the United States Senate because he calls Mitch McConnell a liar in public. He tries to undercut his own leadership all the time. So I think it's got to be one of the so-called establishment candidates who's got a prayer of doing it. My theory is that the Republican Party always goes wandering into the wilderness and having love affairs with Michelle Bachmann and Herman Cain and Pat Buchanan and Rick Santorum, but eventually wends its way by a circuitous process back to its most electable candidate. And by my lights, the most electable candidates would be Jeb or Marco Rubio or John Kasich or Chris Christie, the so-called establishment candidates, who have a prayer of getting Hispanic votes, young people's votes, women's votes. I just don't see Cruz or Trump or even Carly Fiorina, for that matter, being able to do that.
A Republican consultant reminded me the other day, his name is Charlie Black, very conservative, that In the last 10 or so elections, Republicans, the field winnows down in a Republican presidential race, and you wind up with a mainstream candidate and an outside candidate, an insurgent candidate. And every time, the mainstream candidate wins.
Except in 1964.
Wasn't going back that far.
Yeah, but that's the danger. I mean, and the Republican Party did it in Indiana, did it in Nevada. I mean, Harry Reid would be gone if the Republicans had nominated an electable candidate in the Nevada race against Harry Reid. But they nominated a wacko, and the result of it was that Harry Reid got reelected.
Next question.
Do you think that the bigotry of nowadays that you mentioned due to the financial situation would change if the chosen political leaders would keep consistency by following up with the management of the government from their previous leaders, instead of out with the old and in with the new?
There is a tendency on the part of new presidents to do, especially if they're of the other party, to do the exact opposite of what their predecessor did. Now, to some extent, that's natural. If you're going to change parties, it means that the country has decided that what the predecessor did was not the right thing to do. So, if a Republican president is going to get elected, he is not going to continue with Obamacare as Obamacare is written. He or she will adjust it. I hope that the repeal mania will dissipate and the reform or rewrite theme will be observed, and that there will be a rewrite of Obamacare and not just an attempt to throw it out.
Why?
Because 50 million Americans should not be without health insurance.
That's not going to happen in any case. I mean, look at all the Republican alternatives don't do that.
Well,
anyway, we'll move on.
We're going to be here for
Yes,
Governor Wilson has a question.
Yes, I do. In 1991, after Desert Storm had been such a striking military success, George H.W. Bush's popularity was something like 90%, his approval rating. By 1992, James Carville in the war room of the Clinton administration the watchword was, "It's the economy, stupid." Do you think that there is much of a chance for this coming election in 2016 to turn on foreign policy considerations far more than in recent elections?
Yes.
No,
Would you like to elaborate?
Go ahead, Mort.
Well, I think Obama's foreign policy has been a disaster. I mean, we are in terrible shape vis-a-vis ISIS, with Iran, with China, with Russia. Leading from behind is not going to work. Because there is no one else following if America doesn't lead, and and the challenges are great, and they're getting worse because the Russians think that the United States is backed out of the Middle East and is inserting itself in America's place. The Chinese think that they can build these islands and dominate the South China Sea. Now, Obama, to his credit, is sending ships to challenge this the Chinese assertion of sovereignty over those areas. So we're not quite as weak in East Asia as we are other places. But for sure, and if Hillary is the nominee, forget about Benghazi and the lies about the explanation for what happened to the people who were killed there. What did she do as Secretary of State? I mean, there is not a single achievement that I can think of. She traveled more than any Secretary of State has ever done. She let her hair go to hell. for what reason I do not know, but I guess she wanted to. She thought that the Angela Merkel look was the way to go, and she made a lot of nice speeches, but she didn't accomplish anything. So
Please, no one repeat what he said about it.
I'll stand
Sure.
behind it.
Follow-up is just this. Mort a moment ago made the comment that the American people, in terms of information, are in two different worlds. And I have to say that I emphatically agree. And how in the hell do we change that? Because the people that listen to Fox News, I think with whatever its flaws, have a pretty good idea of the foreign policy failures of this administration. I don't see how the hell they could miss. I have no confidence whatever that the people who are listening to the so-called mainstream media have a clue. And that's
No,
why
that-
it's...
No, they do. They do.
No, they
do.
don't.
No, wait.
Look, this shows
You
up in
look,
the polls.
this is the Beltway.
No,
Wait
wait a minute,
just a second.
Mort, stop for a minute. It does. No,
Is
look,
the
I just
Iran
wanna make
agreement
one-
popular?
I just want to make
No.
one point, and the point is this: this is manifested in polls. You do not see. I agree that the U.S. is in retreat all around the world, but you do not see national outrage over that.
That's my point.
And so that, I think, well, that's a good point that I agree with. Because of that, I'm afraid that the foreign policy and national security issue will not be that strong, that productive an issue for Republicans to use in 2016. I fear that that's the case. You see the example of the difference in the way things are covered, particularly in Hillary Clinton's Benghazi testimony. And in particular, if you remember Jim Jordan, there were two documents released that showed that she knew from the beginning that this video, this anti-Muslim video, had nothing to do with the protest and the killing of the ambassador in Benghazi and 3 other Americans. Had nothing to do with it. And yet that she and Barack Obama and other Democrats said for 2 weeks that this video was what caused that, caused that attack on the American officials there. Now, why would she say that? Why was Obama saying that? Because they were worried, because it was Al-Qaeda that had done it, an Al-Qaeda affiliate, and that clashed with the claim of the Obama administration that they defeated Al-Qaeda, that Al-Qaeda was on the run. And yet, if you looked at the Washington Post and the New York Times the next day, as I did, one paragraph about that in each paper that was opaque. You couldn't tell what had happened. But these were compelling documents that showed that Hillary knew what had caused it, and she said for weeks the opposite.
Absolutely. And the New York Times, day after day, ignores the same thing that is front page news on Fox and the Wall Street Journal.
I disagree. I think that the world, the country understands that the Iran deal is a bad deal. 60% are against it. The country understands that ISIS is chopping heads and crucifying people on Obama's watch. You know, the New York Times is not hiding that. It knows that the Russians are bombing our allies in Syria, not ISIS. I just don't. Maybe the volume is not as great as it would be on Fox News, but I think the American people understand that. I don't know what the polls even show about support for Obama's foreign policy, but I bet you it's very low.
It's not.
I bet it is. We'll look it up. Google it. Somebody, quick.
No, but I think, Governor, you made a great point that I think the public's divided on that when it should be as upset about American foreign policy as Mort thinks it is.
I think it's anesthesia.
What?
It's a kind of anesthesia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they actually know it. I agree with them. They know it, but they won't respond to it. It's a very frightening phenomenon.
Well, maybe that's what it
It's
is.
scarier
I
than
think that's even scarier,
It
and
is
I think
scary.
Roger is right. And that is going to be the trick. How in the name of God do you get people to focus not only on what is happening, but what the real import of it is?
Well, let me just say that this relates to your question about George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush fundamentally was defeated because there was a very mild recession in 1992 that we were coming out of. Bill Clinton made it sound as though it was the deepest recession since the Great Depression. And Bush in his campaign did not know how to counter that with arguments that made the case. Now, what the Republican candidate is going to have to do is make it vivid what is happening in the world and who's responsible for it. I mean, if they can't do it, they don't deserve to get elected president. I mean, what a leader has got to do is explain to the people, and Ronald Reagan did it. He knew how to do it. He's got to explain to the people what it is that's wrong and what he or she is going to do to fix it. And it's got to be a positive alternative. It's got to be policies that will make the public understand that these will work and make their lives and the world better. Anyway.
Next question.
First of all, to some degree, as a young man, I was an undefined Republican until I started watching the Beltway Boys. One conservative, one moderate, kept me balanced. I enjoyed the interaction between you two.
Well, thank you.
My question is, there's nobody in this room that is going to get the next Republican nominee voted president. It's going to be the millennials. It's generational. Just when Jack Kemp was a young man, he was generational a little before his time because he had to wait in a line. The Republican had a line of people that were going to be elected the next president. The times have changed. We need a millennial candidate for president. To me, I believe that he has everything going for him as far as his ethnicity, his looks, the quality of his ideas. Jack Kemp again. Marco Rubio, to me, should be the next nominee for Republicans. The millennials will vote for him. My question is, what do you folks feel?
Look, I think he's made great headway in the last couple of months. It would help if he does well tomorrow night in the debate. He's been good in both of the first two debates. It's interesting along this line that he is the Republican candidate who Democrats, especially the Hillary Clinton people, fear the most. And he is, if he were elected, he is a year older than JFK was when he was elected in 1960. I think JFK was 43, Marco Rubio's 44. Looks younger, but he is 44.
Yeah, my only worry about Marco Rubio is that he's another two-year senator who decided to run for president. We've had one of those.
6 years. He was elected in 2010.
Well, he decided to run for president right away, and he's a first-term senator who has not spent a lot of time being a senator even. Yeah, that's true.
Well, he was the Speaker of the Florida House.
He was.
For
Yeah.
about 10 years.
Yeah, he was.
We have time for one more question. Before we get to that question, there's been a lot of talk of leadership and policy, and that's sort of tied into the gift that we're going to present to our three speakers. It's a leather-bound edition of President Nixon's memoirs, and we'll be sending each of you home with one.
Okay, great.
That will lead
Thank
to
you.
our last question here, and then the Mr. Kondracke and Mr. Barnes will be available up in the front lobby to sign books. If you haven't picked one up, I encourage you to grab one. And our last question.
At your request, I Googled Obama's foreign policy ratings, and recently, August 15th, it says 55% disapprove. On to my question. I trade emails with a guy named Jim Pinkerton. He considers himself a Hamiltonian Republican. That basically means he believes one of the key drivers of economic growth is government spending on infrastructure, education, and innovation. And there's a tradition of that in the Republican Party, and like Dwight Eisenhower, Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln. How is this compatible? Is it compatible with Kempian and Reaganomic supply-side economics?
Jack Kemp was not a big infrastructure guy, but in the current context of things, he did believe that the Republican Party should be the party of Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln was not only the emancipator, but he was also a Whig. And what the Whigs believed is that government had a role in facilitating the right to rise of ordinary people by building infrastructure. And Lord knows we need infrastructure. We need basic research. We need education. We need reform in education primarily. Kemp was in favor of school choice. I think he would be in favor, as Rubio is actually, of trying to figure out how to make college more affordable. I think those are perfectly legitimate things for a Republican to be advocating. And I would think that, I don't know what Kemp would say about that, because it wasn't in the wheelhouse.
I do know what Kemp would say. Kemp would say, yeah, those are fine, but those are not going to spur the kind of economic growth that America needs. Look, these are the things that Obama wants to do. We need to build more bridges. We need to build more highways.
Don't we?
I'm for that. Okay. I'm for that. But that's all he wants to do. Oh. And that's not enough. And he hasn't done it anyway, yeah. Mm-hmm. It may, things like that may make America better. I'm fine with that. But there are not the things that are going to really generate strong economic growth and lift all boats and change America in a positive way.
With all due respect, I would like to see the Republican Congress pass a highway bill.
Well, they will.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Really.